23 pieces of mail in one day and suddenly I'm a criminal mastermind. That's how my new neighbor Susan Rodriguez welcomed me to Maple Valley Estates, standing in my driveway with a calculator and a clipboard like she was conducting a federal investigation. Little did I know this was just the beginning of the most insane HOA drama you've ever heard. Before you watch full story, comment down from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe. I moved to Maple Valley because everyone said it was the perfect quiet neighborhood. Beautiful houses, friendly neighbors, great schools. What they didn't mention was that receiving more than 5 pieces of mail per day apparently makes you a suspected felon. I thought nosy neighbors were bad enough until one decided to turn my mailbox into her personal surveillance project. My name is David Chin and I run a small import business from my home office. I deal with suppliers from 12 different countries, which means I get a lot of international correspondence, shipping documents, customs paperwork, and business contracts. In the city, nobody cared if you got 50 pieces of mail. But apparently in Maple Valley, getting more than a handful of letters makes you Pablo Escobar. The woman with the calculator was Susan Rodriguez, my next-door neighbor who apparently had nothing better to do than monitor my postal deliveries. She wasn't just casually curious, she had systems. A detailed logbook where she recorded every piece of mail that went into my box, color-coded charts showing what she called normal residential patterns, and my address highlighted in red marker as exceeding acceptable limits. When she approached me that first Tuesday morning, she was wearing reading glasses and carrying what looked like an official investigation folder. "I'm Susan Rodriguez from the HOA Compliance Committee," she announced, extending her hand while keeping her calculator visible. "I've been conducting routine neighborhood assessments and your address is showing some concerning irregularities." She clicked her calculator and made a note. 17 pieces yesterday, 21 the day before, 15 last Friday. Most residents average 3 to 5 pieces daily, but you're consistently in what we classify as commercial activity territory. The way she said "we" made it sound like she had an entire team of mail surveillance experts backing her up. I explained that I run an import business, that I work with international suppliers, and that much of my correspondence comes through traditional mail because many overseas companies still prefer physical documentation for contracts and shipping manifests. But instead of understanding, Susan pulled out what looked like a professional investigation binder and started asking for my business license, tax documentation, and detailed client information. "The HOA needs to verify you're not running unauthorized commercial operations," she said, making aggressive notes. "We've researched mail volume patterns in residential communities, and your numbers match several red flag indicators for fraudulent activity. Being in business, you learn to recognize when someone is fishing for information they have no right to request." Susan's interrogation felt exactly like that, except instead of trying to steal business secrets, she was trying to find any excuse to validate her suspicions about my perfectly legal home office. I kept my responses polite but vague, explaining that client confidentiality prevented sharing specific details. This clearly frustrated her, and she made several pointed notes before promising that ongoing monitoring would continue until we can verify your activities are legitimate. That's when I noticed she had a measuring tape and what appeared to be a professional camera with a zoom lens. She'd been documenting the distance from my mailbox to my front door, photographing package dimensions, and creating what looked like a comprehensive surveillance file on my daily routine. "I have every right to photograph anything visible from public property," she explained when I asked what she was doing. "Community safety requires thorough documentation of potential zoning violations and suspicious delivery patterns." The most disturbing part was discovering that she'd been going door to door with official-looking forms, asking neighbors to report observations about my business activities. She'd created what she called a neighborhood security assessment, with checkboxes for different types of suspicious activity, essentially recruiting other residents to participate in surveilling my perfectly normal work-from-home lifestyle. My neighbor Tom Wilson, a retired mechanic who lived across the street, pulled me aside the next day. "Listen, David," he said quietly, "Susan came by asking me to keep track of when you get deliveries and whether I've noticed any unusual foot traffic at your house." She made it sound official like the HOA required it, but something felt off about the whole thing. By the end of that first week, I realized that installing security cameras hadn't been paranoid, it was going to be essential for documenting what was clearly becoming a systematic harassment campaign. Susan Rodriguez wasn't just a nosy neighbor with boundary issues. She was someone with an obsessive need to control her environment who had decided that my business correspondence represented some kind of threat to community security. That evening, I upgraded my entire security system and began keeping detailed logs of every interaction with neighbors. When you're dealing with what professionals call a persistent problem person, documentation becomes your best defense. I told myself this was probably just an isolated incident with an overly zealous HOA member, but deep down I knew this was only the beginning of something much more complicated. I had no idea that her clipboard surveillance was just the opening move in what would become a neighborhood war involving law enforcement, public hearings, and social media drama that would change our community forever. The next morning, I saw something that made me realize I wasn't dealing with a normal person anymore. Susan had erected a small whiteboard in her front yard with the message, "Mail count for 1247 Maple Drive, today 16 pieces. Status, under investigation." It was like something you'd see at a sports stadium, except instead of showing game scores, it was broadcasting my personal mail statistics to the entire neighborhood. Tom Wilson walked over and whispered to me, "She calls it Project Community Watch. She's also started a neighborhood Facebook group where she posts daily updates about your mail deliveries." I realized I wasn't just dealing with a nosy neighbor anymore. This was someone who had turned harassment into a semi-professional operation. Within days, Susan had transformed from annoying clipboard lady into what could only be described as the commander of a suburban surveillance network. She'd recruited Maria Santos, who worked at the post office and had that naturally suspicious personality that made her receptive to theories about neighborhood mail fraud schemes. Together, they'd established scheduled observation periods, coordinated photography sessions, and detailed documentation procedures that would have impressed actual law enforcement agencies. But the whiteboard was just the beginning. Susan had also started conducting what she called community safety briefings during mail delivery times. Yes, you heard that right. Susan was literally providing running commentary about my mail delivery routine to anyone who would listen, positioning herself strategically near my mailbox like she was narrating a nature documentary about suspicious suburban behavior. Day 14 of monitoring the anomalous mail volume situation at 1247 Maple Drive, she announced to Maria Santos while I was getting my mail. The subject continues receiving excessive commercial correspondence with no apparent legitimate business explanation. Today's preliminary count is already 13 pieces, and it's only 11:30 a.m. Lisa Martinez, the single mother who lived 2 houses down, was dealing with her own Susan harassment campaign. She pulled her son's skateboard into her garage and whispered to me, "She once reported me to the city because my trash can was still at the curb at 8 p.m. Don't expect this to blow over if she's still carrying that notebook." Lisa explained that Susan had filed complaints about Diego's toys being left in the front yard overnight, the family's inconsistent lawn maintenance schedule, and what she termed aesthetic violations that were allegedly affecting neighborhood property values. It was becoming clear that my mail situation wasn't isolated. Susan was systematically targeting anyone whose lifestyle didn't match her narrow definition of acceptable suburban behavior. But Susan's operation wasn't limited to observation and commentary. She created what she called community awareness flyers, and distributed them throughout the neighborhood. These weren't casual notes, they were professionally designed documents with official-looking graphics, urgent warnings about potential mail fraud schemes in residential areas, and detailed instructions for residents to recognize and report suspicious postal activity patterns. The flyers included photographs of my packages, a clear privacy violation, and encouraged neighbors to document unusual delivery schedules and report their observations to the HOA committee. The most bizarre escalation was when I discovered that Susan had contacted the Postal Service directly to file what she called a suspicious activity report about my address. She'd claimed that the volume of mail I received indicated possible mail theft, package fraud, or identity theft operations. She'd also submitted formal complaints to the city about potential zoning violations and unauthorized commercial activity, based on nothing more than her surveillance data and conspiracy theories about suburban crime patterns. Maria Santos, to her credit, began questioning Susan's methods when she suggested they should start opening packages that looked suspicious. "That's when I realized this wasn't about community safety anymore," Maria told me privately. She was enjoying the drama and the attention more than actually protecting anyone. Maria approached me to apologize for initially supporting what she now understood was systematic harassment rather than legitimate neighborhood watch activity. The situation reached a new level of absurdity when I received my first official HOA correspondence, a formal letter requesting detailed documentation about my home-based business operations and proof of compliance with residential zoning restrictions. The letter, clearly influenced by Susan's pressure campaign, mentioned that multiple community members had raised concerns about commercial mail volume and that the HOA was legally obligated to investigate potential covenant violations. Robert Kim, the HOA president, had obviously been manipulated into taking official action despite his clear discomfort with the situation. This was when I shifted from annoyed resident to full business owner protection mode. I created a comprehensive documentation system, logging every interaction with Susan, photographing her surveillance activities, and building timeline visualizations that clearly showed the escalation from curiosity to stalking to organized harassment. I researched HOA bylaws, local privacy laws, and zoning regulations to understand exactly what rights I had and what legal boundaries Susan was systematically violating with her surveillance campaign. While I was building my defense documentation, Susan was escalating her social media presence beyond the neighborhood group. She'd started posting on community forums and local discussion boards about mail fraud warning signs and protecting suburban communities from suspicious residents. Her posts included detailed theories about how criminals might use residential addresses for illegal operations, photographs of my mail and packages, and instructions for other communities to implement similar monitoring programs to identify potential threats. Lisa Martinez had become an unexpected ally in this increasingly surreal conflict. After witnessing Susan's whiteboard spectacle and realizing that the harassment extended beyond my situation, Lisa began documenting her own experiences with Susan's complaints and sharing information about the scope of the surveillance operation. She asked me to keep a log of your work schedule and report any visitors or unusual activity, Lisa revealed. She wanted me to note what time your lights went on and off, when you got deliveries, and whether you had any overnight guests. The breaking point came when I discovered that Susan had been attempting to access the HOA's internal communications using social engineering tactics. I found evidence of multiple calls to the property management company where she'd posed as a board member trying to gain access to private homeowner information, financial records, and confidential HOA discussions. She wasn't just harassing individual residents, she was trying to infiltrate the community's administrative systems to gather intelligence for her expanding campaign against anyone she deemed suspicious. By the end of that second week, Susan's whiteboard had become a neighborhood attraction that was drawing visitors from other communities who wanted to see the mail counting house. People were taking photos and sharing videos of her surveillance setup on social media platforms throughout the region, turning our quiet suburban street into a minor tourist destination for people interested in bizarre HOA drama. What had started as harassment targeting me had evolved into a public spectacle that was affecting property values and making everyone in the neighborhood uncomfortable. I realized that treating this like a standard business threat assessment was the right approach, but I needed to understand that Susan's obsession with controlling and monitoring her neighbors was much more systematic and potentially dangerous than typical neighborhood disputes. She had the persistence of a professional investigator, the paranoia of a conspiracy theorist, and the social media skills to make life miserable for anyone who didn't conform to her expectations of normal residential behavior. The pounding on my door started at exactly 7 a.m. on a Friday morning, the kind of aggressive knocking that immediately tells you this isn't a friendly neighbor visit or a package delivery. I stumbled out of bed, threw on clothes, and opened the door to find Officer Patricia Murphy standing there with a uniformed partner, both of them looking like they were prepared for a serious criminal investigation rather than a neighborhood dispute. Behind them, I could see Susan standing in her front yard with her phone held high, clearly recording the entire scene with what appeared to be barely contained excitement. "David Chin? I'm Officer Murphy with the County Sheriff's Office. We need to discuss some serious allegations that have been made regarding fraudulent mail operations at this address." Her tone was professional but stern, and the presence of a backup officer made it clear this wasn't a casual inquiry. As she spoke, I could see neighbors emerging from their houses, some in bathrobes and pajamas, drawn by the commotion of police cars in our quiet suburban street. Several people were openly filming the scene with their phones, and I realized this was exactly the kind of public spectacle that Susan had been hoping to create. Officer Murphy explained that someone had filed detailed criminal complaints alleging that I was operating a mail fraud scheme, using my residential address to receive stolen mail, process fraudulent documents, and coordinate identity theft operations. The complainant had provided what she described as extensive documentation of my mail delivery patterns, photographs of packages, detailed theories about criminal operations, and claims that I had been evasive and uncooperative when questioned about my business activities by concerned community members. While the officer was explaining the allegations, I watched Susan conducting what appeared to be live commentary for her social media audience. She was standing just close enough to be in the background of any photos or videos being taken, gesturing toward my house and clearly narrating the police investigation as validation of her months-long surveillance campaign. Her whiteboard had been updated with new text that read, "Investigation in progress," with flashing battery-operated lights, creating exactly the kind of dramatic visual that would make compelling content for anyone documenting the scene. The investigation itself was thorough and invasive. Officer Murphy required complete documentation of my business operations, tax returns, business license, import permits, customs documentation, and detailed explanations of every aspect of my import business. She interviewed me extensively about my daily routine, my professional relationships, and the specific types of materials I regularly received through mail delivery. Her partner conducted a walkthrough of my home office, photographing my computer equipment, examining my filing systems, and documenting anything that might be relevant to the fraud allegations. But the most humiliating aspect was the public nature of the investigation. While police were inside my house, Susan had arranged for a bright red notice to be posted on my front door announcing that I was under investigation for violation of community standards and potential criminal activity. The notice was designed to be visible from the street and included language encouraging other residents to report any additional suspicious observations to authorities. It was essentially a public shaming device that marked my home as somehow dangerous or problematic. The neighborhood's reaction was immediate and polarizing. Some residents gathered in small groups, clearly gossiping about what kind of criminal activity might have been happening right under their noses. Others approached Officer Murphy directly, offering their own observations about my mail delivery patterns and expressing concern about property values and community safety. Lisa Martinez stood in her front yard with her arms crossed, clearly frustrated by the spectacle, while elderly Mrs. Patterson shook her head disapprovingly at the crowds of people treating this like entertainment rather than a serious investigation. What made the situation even more surreal was Susan's social media commentary throughout the process. She was providing live updates about the investigation, speculating about what police might find, and encouraging her followers to share the stream to spread awareness about mail fraud schemes in suburban communities. Her posts were using hashtags like #NeighborhoodSafety and #MailFraudAlert, and she was clearly enjoying the attention and validation that came from having law enforcement take her complaints seriously. Officer Murphy spent over 3 hours reviewing my documentation, contacting my business references, and verifying my import credentials with various agencies and certification boards. She was thorough but fair, asking pointed questions about my work while also noting, off the record, that the complaint showed signs of obsessive documentation that raised its own concerns about the complainant's motivations. When she contacted the customs office, they confirmed not only my legitimate business status but also expressed surprise that anyone would question the credentials of someone who had been thoroughly vetted by federal trade authorities. The investigation concluded with complete vindication. Officer Murphy found absolutely no evidence of illegal activity and noted that my business operations were not only legitimate but also important for regional economic development. However, she took time to warn me about harassment laws and the potential for filing counter-complaints if Susan's behavior continued to escalate. She also mentioned that filing false police reports was a serious crime that carried significant penalties, including potential jail time and mandatory restitution for investigation costs. As the police cars were leaving, I watched Susan's demeanor shift from excited anticipation to obvious disappointment. Her social media audience was asking questions about why no arrests were being made, and she was scrambling to explain why the investigation hadn't resulted in the dramatic criminal bust she'd been promising. But instead of backing down, she seemed to interpret the lack of charges as evidence that authorities needed more information, and she was already talking about additional evidence gathering and expanded surveillance operations. That evening, I found the red investigation notice had been vandalized with additional text that wasn't part of the official HOA posting. Someone had added handwritten warnings about mail fraud operations and community threat assessment, clearly trying to escalate the public shaming beyond what even the HOA had authorized. I had security camera footage of Susan approaching my door after the police left, but the vandalism had occurred during a period when she had alibis from neighbors who could verify her location. The most disturbing realization was that having the police completely clear me of wrongdoing hadn't ended Susan's campaign, it had only made her more desperate to find something, anything, that would validate months of surveillance and harassment. She had crossed every line regarding privacy and basic civility, involving law enforcement in her personal vendetta and creating a public spectacle that had turned our quiet neighborhood into a source of community-wide conflict and drama. She had just demonstrated that she was willing to weaponize the criminal justice system to attack a neighbor whose only crime was receiving business mail at his home address. Now I was going to show her what happens when you target someone with professional business skills and absolutely nothing left to lose. The gloves were officially off. Susan had escalated our dispute to criminal allegations, involved law enforcement, and attempted to destroy my reputation based on nothing but her own paranoid theories. It was time to stop playing defense and start conducting what I like to call offensive business intelligence, using the same techniques I employed to research overseas suppliers and verify business credentials, except this time my target was a suburban neighborhood Karen who had no idea she was about to face someone with professional-grade investigation skills. I began with comprehensive research, starting with social media analysis and public record searches. What I discovered was even more disturbing than I'd expected. Susan hadn't just been harassing me, she'd been conducting systematic campaigns against residents in multiple communities over the past several years. Using advanced search techniques and cross-referencing public records, I discovered that she'd been creating anonymous accounts on various community forums and complaint websites to file false reports against neighbors who didn't meet her standards of normal residential behavior. The pattern was remarkable in its consistency and disturbing in its scope. In her previous neighborhood, she'd filed anonymous complaints against a home-based bakery owner, accusing them of commercial zoning violations and food safety concerns. She'd reported a freelance graphic designer for excessive package deliveries and suspicious business activities. Most troubling was her campaign against a retired teacher who'd been investigated for potential mail fraud based on her reports about unusual correspondence patterns, essentially the same playbook she was using against me. But the real breakthrough came when I traced the digital fingerprints of recent anonymous complaints filed against various residents in our current neighborhood. Using business research tools and cross-referencing timestamps with known events, I discovered that Susan had been filing complaints against at least 6 different households using fake names and email addresses. She'd reported Mrs. Patterson for suspected prescription drug distribution because of her regular pharmacy deliveries. She'd accused Tom Wilson of possible insurance fraud activities before trying to recruit him as her surveillance partner. Most shocking was her anonymous report claiming that Lisa Martinez was potentially neglecting her child based on observing Diego playing outside unsupervised. This was when I decided to create what I privately called my Neighborhood Transparency Dashboard, a comprehensive digital monitoring system that would track all HOA communications, complaint filings and decision-making processes in real time. Using publicly available information and Freedom of Information requests, I built a database that could identify patterns in complaint submissions, track resolution times, and analyze voting patterns among board members. It was designed to look like a standard community information portal, but it was actually a sophisticated data analysis tool that would expose any irregular or discriminatory enforcement activities. The dashboard revealed something that even I hadn't expected. Robert Kim and other board members were being systematically manipulated by a flood of anonymous complaints that all traced back to Susan's various fake accounts. She'd been creating the impression of widespread community concern about multiple residents when in reality it was just one person with an obsessive need to control her neighbor's behavior. The board was making decisions based on what they believed was genuine community input, not realizing they were being fed manufactured outrage by a single individual. My investigation also uncovered evidence that Susan had been attempting to gain unauthorized access to the HOA's administrative systems. Phone logs showed multiple calls where she'd posed as different board members trying to access private homeowner information, financial records, and internal HOA communications. This behavior crossed the line from harassment into potential fraud territory. But the most damaging discovery was a series of fabricated documents that Susan had been preparing to present as evidence against me and other residents. Using document analysis techniques I'd learned in business verification, I found that she'd been creating fake correspondence, altering photographs, and falsifying timestamps to build what she believed would be a compelling case against her targets. The documents were sophisticated enough to fool casual examination, but they contained digital fingerprints that clearly proved they'd been manufactured rather than genuine evidence of wrongdoing. Lisa Martinez had become a crucial ally during this investigation phase, providing information about Susan's attempts to recruit other residents as informants and surveillance partners. Lisa revealed that Susan had been offering to help with various neighborhood issues in exchange for residents reporting suspicious activities they observed at targeted houses. She'd been building a network of unwitting accomplices who thought they were participating in legitimate community safety initiatives. Tom Wilson's complete transformation from Susan's deputy to my primary source of inside information proved invaluable during this period. He provided detailed accounts of Susan's planning sessions, her theories about various residents, and her increasingly desperate strategies for maintaining credibility after the police investigation had cleared me of wrongdoing. Tom revealed that Susan had been talking about expanding the investigation to include other government agencies and potentially filing civil lawsuits against residents she couldn't eliminate through HOA enforcement. The psychological profile I was developing painted a picture of someone whose past experiences had evolved into a sophisticated harassment operation that used technology, bureaucracy, and social manipulation to terrorize anyone who didn't conform to her expectations. But what made Susan particularly dangerous was her ability to present herself as a concerned community member while systematically destroying her neighbors' peace and privacy through calculated campaigns of false accusations and manufactured evidence. Armed with comprehensive documentation of her harassment patterns, evidence of her fake complaint submissions, and proof of her attempts to access private HOA information, I was ready to present a case that would not only clear my name but expose the full scope of her operations. The HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, and I intended to use it as the venue for what business professionals call stakeholder presentation, publicly identifying and documenting exactly who had been responsible for the community's recent problems. I had been building this investigation like a business case presentation, methodically gathering evidence and preparing for a presentation that would demonstrate not only my innocence but also the systematic nature of Susan's harassment campaign. But I hadn't anticipated that she would attempt one final desperate gambit that would backfire so spectacularly that it would become the definitive proof of everything I'd been documenting. The community meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. on Thursday evening, but the clubhouse was already packed by 6:30 with what looked like the largest HOA gathering in the neighborhood's history. Word had spread about the ongoing dispute, and residents were genuinely curious to see how this dramatic conflict would be resolved. What I hadn't expected was the presence of Jennifer Walsh, a local news reporter who specialized in community disputes and suburban governance issues, complete with a cameraman and professional equipment that would broadcast our neighborhood drama to viewers throughout the region. Susan had clearly prepared for this meeting like it was her moment of ultimate vindication. She arrived with multiple binders, a laptop computer, and what appeared to be a prepared presentation that she titled, Protecting Maple Valley, a Community Safety Case Study. She had also brought Maria Santos as her key witness, apparently unaware that Maria had been secretly cooperating with my investigation for weeks and providing detailed information about her harassment tactics and falsified evidence. Robert Kim struggled to maintain order as residents filled every available seat and lined the walls of the clubhouse. The formal agenda listed the item as discussion of resident compliance issues and community standards, but everyone knew this was really about whether the neighborhood would continue to tolerate Susan's systematic harassment of residents whose behavior didn't meet her narrow definition of acceptable suburban living. When Robert called the meeting to order and introduced the agenda item, Susan immediately requested permission to present what she called crucial evidence of ongoing criminal activity that threatens our community's safety and property values. She stood up with obvious confidence and began what can only be described as a prosecutorial presentation, complete with slides, charts, and detailed documentation of her months-long surveillance campaign against me and several other residents. But then came her critical mistake. Susan announced that she had obtained confidential correspondence that would prove my involvement in fraudulent activities. She dramatically produced what she claimed were copies of incriminating emails and business documents that had been provided by concerned community members who had access to this evidence. As she began reading from these documents, describing their contents as proof of mail fraud and identity theft operations, I could barely contain my satisfaction at what was about to happen. I calmly stood up and requested permission to respond to these allegations using my own presentation. I appreciate Mrs. Rodriguez's thorough documentation, I said, connecting my laptop to the projector system, and I think the community will find my technical analysis of her evidence quite illuminating. The first slide of my presentation was titled, Document Forensics: How to Identify Manufactured Evidence, and I could see Susan's confident expression beginning to shift toward concern as she realized I wasn't responding defensively. My presentation methodically dismantled every piece of evidence Susan had presented, using metadata analysis to demonstrate that her supposedly confidential documents had been created on her own computer just 2 days earlier. The projection screen showed timestamps, file properties, and digital fingerprints that proved beyond any doubt that she had fabricated the incriminating correspondence and then tried to present it as genuine evidence obtained from external sources. But the most devastating moment came when I displayed security camera footage showing Susan in her own home office using document editing software to create fake letterheads and forge correspondence with suspicious return addresses. The footage included timestamps and clear views of her computer screen as she manufactured the evidence she'd planned to use against me. The clubhouse erupted in gasps and murmurs as residents realized they were watching someone actively committing the kind of fraud she'd been accusing others of perpetrating. The audience's reaction shifted from shock to nervous laughter when I displayed a side-by-side comparison of Susan's whiteboard messages and her anonymous complaint submissions, showing that the timing and language were identical down to specific phrases and typos. One resident actually laughed out loud when the presentation showed that she'd been copy-pasting text between her public displays and her fake complaint letters, creating a digital paper trail that definitively connected her to months of anonymous harassment. Jennifer Walsh's news camera was capturing everything, and I could see her producer frantically taking notes as the story evolved from a simple neighborhood dispute into a comprehensive exposure of systematic deception and harassment. Lisa Martinez stood up to provide testimony about her own experiences with Susan's harassment, describing the fake complaints about child neglect and the attempts to recruit neighbors as surveillance partners. Mrs. Patterson shocked everyone by revealing that Susan had approached her with theories about prescription drug distribution and had actually tried to convince her to monitor other residents' medical deliveries for suspicious pharmaceuticals. Tom Wilson publicly apologized for initially supporting Susan's campaign and provided detailed accounts of her planning sessions and her increasingly desperate strategies as the evidence mounted. As the community absorbed the full scope of what had been revealed, Susan's demeanor shifted from confident prosecutor to desperate defendant. She accused me of being a professional manipulator who had somehow fabricated the digital evidence and convinced other residents to lie on my behalf. She claimed that the timestamps and metadata could be easily falsified by someone with my business skills, not realizing that her argument was essentially admitting that she understood how digital evidence could be manufactured knowledge that supported rather than undermined my case against her. The most damaging testimony came when Jennifer Walsh announced that several viewers of her live broadcast had recognized Susan from her activities in previous communities and were providing real-time information about similar harassment campaigns she'd conducted elsewhere. The news station was receiving calls from former neighbors describing identical patterns of surveillance, false accusations and manufactured evidence, creating a documented history of her behavior that extended far beyond our community. The community vote was unanimous. Residents formally censured Susan's conduct, established new policies prohibiting harassment and unauthorized surveillance of neighbors, and passed a resolution supporting residents' rights to receive mail and conduct legitimate business activities without interference. But more importantly, the meeting had provided definitive proof that Susan's entire campaign was based on fabricated evidence and systematic deception rather than genuine community concerns. As residents were filing out of the clubhouse, discussing the dramatic revelations they had witnessed, Susan approached me with an expression that was equal parts fury and desperation. "This isn't over," she said quietly, her voice shaking with barely controlled anger. "I know what you really are, and I'm going to prove it no matter what it takes." Her threat was clear, but after what had just been exposed about her methods and motivations, it was also obviously the promise of someone who had lost all credibility and was facing the possibility of serious legal consequences for her harassment campaign. I thought that public vindication and comprehensive exposure of her deception would finally end our neighborhood conflict. I should have realized that someone capable of systematic fraud and harassment wouldn't simply accept defeat and disappear quietly into suburban anonymity. The resolution came faster than I expected, but not in the way anyone could have predicted. 3 days after the community meeting, I received a phone call from Susan's sister, Carmen Rodriguez, who had seen the news coverage and wanted to discuss the situation. Carmen explained that Susan had been struggling with anxiety and control issues ever since being victimized by an actual mail fraud scheme several years earlier. The experience had cost her $8,000 and left her with an overwhelming fear that she might be targeted again. She started seeing criminals everywhere, Carmen explained. Every unusual activity in the neighborhood became a potential threat that she needed to investigate and eliminate. Carmen had been trying to convince Susan to seek professional help for months, but the validation she received from recruiting other residents to support her surveillance activities had made her believe that her behavior was not only normal but necessary for community protection. The news coverage and public exposure of her manufactured evidence had finally broken through her denial. She was ready to accept that her response to trauma had evolved into behavior that was hurting innocent people. Susan agreed to resign from all HOA positions, participate in a structured counseling program, and make formal apologies to everyone she had harassed. In exchange, I agreed not to pursue legal action for the false police reports and harassment. But the most important outcome was that our community used this crisis as an opportunity to implement real reforms. We established clear procedures for handling complaints, created an independent mediation process for resolving disputes, and passed bylaws specifically protecting residents' privacy rights. Lisa Martinez was elected to the HOA board, bringing a perspective focused on supporting families rather than policing normal residential activities. Tom Wilson became our new compliance coordinator, with a mandate to help residents understand regulations rather than catch them in violations. 6 months later, I received a handwritten letter from Susan. She was participating in therapy, had moved to a smaller community near her family, and was working to understand how her trauma response had affected her behavior and her relationships with others. She apologized for the harm she had caused and thanked me for handling the situation in a way that led to her getting help rather than just punishment. The most gratifying outcome was hearing from some of Susan's previous victims in other communities. My documentation of her harassment pattern had provided them with the evidence they needed to address their own unresolved conflicts and find closure for problems they'd faced years earlier. It reinforced my belief that standing up to bullies isn't just about protecting yourself, it's about protecting everyone who might become their next target. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that the best way to handle a neighborhood bully isn't just defeating them, it's fixing the system that enabled their behavior in the first place. When you build something better together, everyone wins, including the bullies who eventually get the help they need. My mail still comes every day, sometimes even more than before as my import business has grown. But nobody counts the pieces anymore. Well, except me, but that's just professional habit. It turns out that when you create a community based on mutual respect instead of surveillance and suspicion, everyone can focus on living their lives instead of policing their neighbors. And if you ever find yourself dealing with an HOA Karen who thinks your mail delivery schedule makes you a criminal mastermind, remember this. Documentation is your best friend, the truth always comes out, and sometimes the best way to help a bully is to refuse to let them keep being one.